How many times can you reuse yeast? When home brewing, some materials can actually be reused, such as yeast. But be aware, there's some certain precautions to deal with. There are different ways to reuse yeast. But one rule of thumb is to only reuse your yeast 5 or 6 times. This video will take you through the science of reusing yeast, how to store it, and much more. How to reuse yeast. Overall, there are 2 methods to collect yeast for reuse. It all depends on if you are collecting from the secondary or the primary fermenter. Secondary collection. It is much easier to reuse the yeast in the secondary than opening up a new pack of yeast. In this collection, there are fewer trubs than in the primary collection. Thereby, you can rack the yeast wort on the top of the yeast cake and already have a fermentation almost immediately. Please note that you don't necessarily need to oxidate the yeast cells. Normally, yeast cells need oxygen during the production phase, but in this concentration, they won't really need to reproduce much. The easiest method to reduce the yeast here is to immediately pour it into the next batch. But of course, you can also store it for later use. Primary collection. The yeast will be more fresh in this stage because it will be closer to its original culture than if you are reusing the yeast from the secondary. It will take a little more effort from you in terms of separating the viable yeast from the trub. This process is originally called decanting, but some might just call it washing or rinsing of the yeast. After you have diluted the mix from yeast and trub, you will have to pour liquid and yeast off the heavier trub. It's possible for you to choose more decanting steps to reduce the amount of trub further, but this is not necessary. How do you store yeast after brewing? You can collect it in a container or jar, or you can split it up into smaller multiple containers. The yeast should always be stored in the fridge. When you are ready to use the yeast after storing, always remember to bring your yeast to pitching temperature before use. The yeast should not be stored more than 4 to 6 weeks, even though it might be able to last longer than that. What should you watch out for while reusing yeast? If the yeast is a bit brown, you should be good to go, but if it's getting darker and browner, do not use it anymore. Your yeast should look thick and creamy. Also, it should not have any so-called off flavor or aromas. It should contain as little trub as possible. If the yeast smells of sulfur or phenolic, don't use it. It might have suffered from sanitation issues or some other type of stress. Bottom line, if you are in doubt whether your yeast is able to be reused, don't reuse it. Subscribe to Homebrew Advice on YouTube for more informational videos in the future.